Well, we are at the appointed hour, so I will commence. My name is David Eichmann. I'm a member of the Winter Lecture Series Planning Committee, and I want to welcome you to the 32nd Annual Winter Lecture Series. Our series title, as most of you know, is National Identity and the Politics of Nationalism. The Winter Lecture Series is sponsored by the Social Action Committee of the Unitarian Church, the Humanities Council, Humanities Nebraska, and OLLI, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, and we thank all of them for their continued participation and support of this series. You know the format, I think, 1 hour presentation minus the couple of minutes I take, and then a short break, 10 or so minutes for cookies and snacks provided by the Unitarian Church members. And there is a basket out there, and your donations are greatly appreciated. They go entirely to bring the series to you. In future years, if you want to receive announcements, please send your email. I think you will have all left that on the sign-in sheet out front, and that helps us get information out to you a little more economically than mailings. If bad weather threatens, I think you know www.unitarianlincoln.org is the website where you can get information. We have been very fortunate this year, and we hope it continues. There's free parking across the street in the parking lot, and I think that's the standard introduction. So again, I want to say thank you to the Winter Lecture Series Board, Unitarian Church, Nebraska Humanities, and Osher Lifelong Learning Institute for their support and efforts in bringing you this enriching series every week during the transition from winter to spring. I always look forward to it as our little spring awakening here in Lincoln. Their generous support and time give us all a chance to consider weighty issues of our time in ways rather deeper than a campaign slogan or a commercial jingle, and this year the gap couldn't be wider. In week one, Professor David Forsythe set the stage for our consideration of nationalism and national identities in this year's series. Last week, Professor Mark Orsag took us to Europe, demonstrating the variety of nationalisms and the various ways they are playing out today among the EU countries. Tonight, Professor Robert Oberst will take us to Asia, a region in which he is comfortably expert, to widen our scope of consideration. Asia remains for most Americans woefully misunderstood and grossly underappreciated. Certainly, this vast segment of the world and humanity remains underreported in the American press unless our oil or other domestic interests are threatened. So it's a pleasure to welcome my colleague and friend, Dr. Oberst. He is professor and chair of political science at Nebraska Wesleyan University. He has focused his research primarily on the South Asian region, with India and Sri Lanka his main areas of interest. He's published nearly 100 scholarly articles and book chapters, and is the primary author of Government and Politics in South Asia, which is now in its 7th edition. He has also been visiting Fulbright Scholar at Cairo University and visiting professor, and I should have asked for pronunciation on this, Paradanaya University, pretty terrible, in Sri Lanka. Yeah, I figured syllables enunciated incorrectly. Professor Oberst has been advisor to U.S. State Department, USAID, and many non-governmental development organizations and agencies. And personally, I think the last point of his introduction is the most significant. He's also been an expert witness in more than 40 asylum cases before the U.S. immigration courts, most of which have involved torture victims. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bob Oberst.
I was worried I was going to sit on it and turn off the power back from my mic, but looks like I didn't. One secret to South Asian names, I should have warned you about it. If you try to pronounce them as monosyllabic, you're going to be somewhat close, but not necessarily. I'll try to get rid of that one. What I'm going to talk about tonight is nationalism in South Asia. And I guess my first trip to South Asia, I'm now trying to remember how long ago it was, over 40 years ago. And I've gone back probably 15 to 20 times. I've lived there for periods upward to, well, on one occasion, almost 2 years. Did my doctoral research in Sri Lanka. I find it a fascinating place. I also find it difficult when I try to put this talk together to try to lump this down into 1 hour and to talk about some of the issues I'm going to talk about. So, in any case, what I want to do is sort of give you an overview of things. I'm going to pick up on some of the things that David Forsyth presented 2 weeks ago. A couple of his quotes are up there from the slides. And sort of try to develop what's going on in South Asia. When you look at the South Asian, well, before I start that, when we look at South Asia, the one thing that Americans tend to have are lots of stereotypes. Anybody, let me just ask, has anybody here been to India or to South Asia? Okay, that's good. Very good. We tend to have a lot of stereotypes, and I'm going to try to sabotage a few of those tonight. South Asia is huge. Is that readable? That's the one. Well, I guess not. All right, I will repeat it. India, with a population of 1.3 billion people, is often seen as a mass of different cultures, 26 languages spoken by more than 1 million people. It will become the most populous nation. Probably in the next 10 to 20 years, it will displace China. Add to that Pakistan with nearly 200 million. Bangladesh with another 160 million. And then the other countries of South Asia, Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, we can throw in Bhutan and the Maldives, they're not very large. Adding close to another 50 billion people. What we have is roughly 1.7 billion people. About almost 1 out of 4 people on Earth live in the South Asian subcontinent. It is a very diverse society, although what I'm going to try to present to you tonight is that it also has forces that pull it together. And that diversity is not as scary as it would be when you look at a society of literally 1/4 of the, well, 22% of the world's population. When we think of India, we tend to think of the extreme, the sort of scary, oops, okay, am I back to my right slide? We tend to think of the extreme features, the extreme factors. We have this idea that Hindus and Muslims hate each other. I'll point this out in a few minutes. India is the world's second largest Muslim population. On any given day, those 180 million Muslims live alongside of Hindus, interacting with them in a very normal manner. Our other stereotypes is that it is a society divided by many languages. I'm going to talk about that in a couple seconds. It is a society divided by many languages, but it's not the same as when you look at, say, the countries of Europe and look at how the languages divide them. Another thing I think most all of you probably, well, it's what I learned when I first learned about India many, many years ago in elementary school. Hindus believe in the sanctity of life, ahimsa, doing no harm to any kind of animal life or anything else. Yet, there are many pockets within Hinduism where they still do animal sacrifice. And that is a very common feature of it. Another one of our stereotypes that we tend to have, I do a lot of work in Sri Lanka, which is a Buddhist country. We all know that Buddhism is a religion of peace and tranquility, meditation, and again, this reverence for human life. Yet in Sri Lanka, you have Buddhist monks who use violence and force to achieve what they want to achieve. Just to give you sort of the contrast, I just mentioned the fact that there are many temples that still carry out animal sacrifice. There's a Hindu temple in Sri Lanka that has a festival every year where mostly chickens are brought to be sacrificed to the goddess Durga. The Buddhist monks, in this peaceful manner, basically threatened to come and kill the Hindu priests who carry out the sacrifice if they did not stop it, and came with guns and weapons to stop the sacrifice. So some of our stereotypes are wrong. We tend only, when we hear about South Asia, it's when there's an earthquake in Nepal and many people are basically die or suffering in the rubble of the collapsed buildings. We hear about it when there's violence in Pakistan. We hear about it when there's something strange going on, child marriages or whatever it may be. The reality is it's a much more complex society. Populations are divided by religion, culture, language. And one of the challenges in the modern world is to try to create and mold a nation state out of all of the diverse population in a society. We do have to do it in the United States. We've done a fairly good job. Other cultures and societies have to do the same thing. There are forces that pull societies apart. There are also forces that pull them together. And I'm going to stress some of this, because I think when I first started learning about India, it was from people who had never been there. They always talked about what a diverse place it was, and it was just never going to last. It would never succeed in the world. And yet it has. And it's been actually pretty successful when you consider what it's done. And that's largely because of the unifying factors. Most South Asians, most Indians, feel and sense a common heritage and history that they have great pride in. And in part, that common heritage and history becomes a link that pulls them together, while their language and religion pulls them apart. Just making sure I'm on the right slide each time. Okay. Even when you look at India and this mass of languages, what you find is that the languages are very similar in many cases. The language of Pakistan is Urdu. The largest language in India is Hindi, spoken by over 400 million people. Urdu is spoken by about 175, 80 million in Pakistan. The languages at the time that India and Pakistan were separated had the same vocabulary. They just used a different alphabet. The Pakistanis used the Arabic script. The Hindi speakers used the Devanagari script of South Asia. But the alphabets were the same. I mean, the vocabulary was the same. The alphabets were different. What has happened in the last 60 years is that the leaders of Pakistan have tried to differentiate their language to define a separate Pakistani identity by every new word that comes into their vocabulary. If the Indians adopt it, anything related to space or modern science, the Pakistanis have to have a different word, so that they're slowly sort of differentiating the language away from that language of India. Politicians are constantly trying to structure nationalism, structure the identity their people have. And I'll talk more about this. Some of this I may link to a little bit of what's going on in the United States right now. But in some cases, what we find in South Asia is you have these diverse languages, but there's about 600 million people that speak a Hindi-based language. And even when you get into, I don't know how much I want to, this is where I always debate how far to go on some of this. In South India, they speak languages that are a different language school, the Dravidian languages, which are considered indigenous to South Asia. In the north, they speak Indo-European languages, which basically come from Latin. And so you've got two different language schools. The largest language of the Dravidians is Tamil. And the second largest language of the Indo-European northern languages is the language that they speak in Bombay, Marathi. They have almost the same vocabulary, a very similar vocabulary, despite being in different language schools. So you have this overlap. So although you can talk about all this mass of languages that differentiate people, there is a lot of similarity that goes beyond that. Quote at the top is not mine. That is from Professor Forsyth from his first talk. I wanted to accentuate this because I think it's a good point. Nation states and nationalism, as he points out, are malleable. They're changeable. They're constantly changing. He comments that there's inherent instability. I would say at least that there's constant change, and societies have to deal with it. India today, and this is what I'm going to spend most of my talk on, is going through an effort to try to change the national identity of their society. And it's something that I think you're going to find a little bit scary when we get into this. Probably the most significant redefinition of national identity in South Asia was the partition by the British when they left the subcontinent. Basically, they divided Pakistan up. For the first time, there was a separate Muslim state and a separate Hindu state. Although the Hindu state, India, had about 10, 15, 20% of its population was Muslim. So it wasn't a complete separation. But basically what they did is they created the grounds for a national identity. And suddenly politicians who had been part of what they called India had to decide that, whether they were part of the new India, which was the Hindu state, and to establish that identity, or they were part of the Pakistani state, which became the Muslim state of Pakistan. And basically you had created identities. On top of that, you had one of the more amusing stories I always laugh at was all of these leaders back in the colonial era were very British oriented. A lot of them had been trained in Britain. They spoke English in their households. And the founder of modern Pakistan, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who had to leave his Indian identity and create this Pakistani identity, was heavily criticized because he always spoke in English. So he promised the people of Pakistan he would speak one day completely in Urdu and not speak a word of English. And to celebrate his success, he went on a national radio address and just slipped into English and made the address in English. Part of this identity, he had to restructure his identity from being an Indian to being a Pakistani. And I mean, in some ways, this was, I don't want to spend time on the history. This was one of the most tumultuous times of any society. There were millions of people who were slaughtered in that partition as people tried to go to one side or the other. And then later when the East, again, I'm not sure how much I'm going to go into background, they're just, get that? Okay. You had, Pakistan was divided into two states. One was the East Pakistan over here that today is Bangladesh. Over here is West Pakistan, which today is Pakistan. In the early 1970s, they held an election between, basically it was a democratic election. The West won, the East did not like that, so they sort of threw out the results and the East seceded from Pakistan and created Bangladesh. And you had another war. And you now had a Bangladeshi identity. You no longer had this East and West Pakistani identity, which when we talk about nationalism, it was almost impossible to have a national identity when your country is separated by 1,500 miles of hostile territory. And so, I mean, in a sense, it was sort of inevitable that the Bengalis, the Bangladeshis would pull out and create their own state, which they eventually did with the help of India. Again, India sort of got their little pleasure out of hurting Pakistan. Now, where am I? Here, I've just gone backwards, haven't I? Yes. Okay. What you find in India today is a changing sense of national identity. Again, I forget It's a later slide that you're going to see this. What you're finding in India is an effort to redefine national identity. This is the government, and I'll talk a little bit about Narendra Modi in a couple of minutes. What you have are political movements, or a political movement in India, that's trying to completely redefine what it means to be an Indian, and to make it more in line with being Hindu, and especially also being from North India. These things happen over time. I point out that media can do it, but media doesn't have control over it. Politicians and political movements often can change our identity by stressing the differences between us and them. And so what you have in India is this political movement that's growing. The identity is constantly being challenged. Pakistan battles in an effort to create a Pakistani identity. You have the Northwest Territories, a lot of this you're familiar with because of the war in Afghanistan. You have tribal people, the Pathan tribesmen up in the Northwest, who really have lived independently of any political structure and don't want to be part of, or don't have any sense of Pakistani identity. You also have a tribal movement over here in the desert of Balochistan. The Baluchis, again, don't want any part of Pakistan. Pakistan has to somehow merge these groups together. Within... Okay, where am I? Okay, I've got to watch this thumb. It's kind of getting out of control. What I'm going to talk about in a few minutes is India is trying to redefine what it means to be the Indian state and redefine it as a Hindu state. And the current leadership and government are working very hard at that, and I'll have a lot to say about that. So you have this effort to how do you define this vast nation of 1.3 billion people. In the south, and far down in the south of the island of Sri Lanka, off the coast of India, you have an effort of the dominant ethnic group, the Sinhalese, trying to, in many ways, redefine their country as a Sinhalese Buddhist society at the expense of the Tamils who live in the society. I keep watching to make sure the slide is up there. The Tamils are Hindu, the Sinhalese are Buddhist, they speak different languages. The northern part, let's see how my long distance goes, up in the north are where the Tamils live. There we go, I just hit it again. In the south are the Sinhalese. Okay, I apologize. I've got to figure out how to use the pointer. Maybe I'll just walk over there in the future. Basically what you have is a struggle to try to create a national identity. Sri Lanka went through a 30-year civil war that ended in a horrible bloodbath with probably close to 50,000 people, mostly civilians, being killed in the final 6 months of the war and the conflict. Now they are trying to somehow come out of that period, and there are lots of difficulties. I'm not going to spend a lot of time tonight talking about that. I want to talk more about India. So you have these societies that are trying to change. They're trying to create this new identity, unite their population. Again, I have a quote from David Forsyth. I like the idea of the manifest destiny. We're going to talk about that. Most societies have a vision of some future that they're trying to achieve or return to a glorious past. That sense of manifest destiny and a sense of exceptionalism. I think in your talk, David, you refer to everybody's exceptionalism. I could spend the talk talking about Indian exceptionalism, Sri Lankan exceptionalism, Pakistani. Every society believes they have something special to offer. Now, when we talk about this, let me talk a little bit about the current movement in India. Narendra Modi is the Prime Minister of India, and I don't know how much many of you follow this. He was elected in May of 2014. He's been in office now for just under 2 years. He was the chief minister, which is the same as a governor when you have parliamentary systems in states. I'm scared to touch the pointer again. He was the chief minister of the state of Gujarat. And he was known when he was in charge of the state. I'll call him governor, though it's not called a governor. But when he was governor, the state began to develop rapidly. Things got done. He basically made things happen. He made deals with people. He negotiated deals. Everything went very, very well. He didn't tolerate corruption. He's a very, very, in a sense, simple guy. He lives in a 2- or 3-room house. Gave up all of the joys of normal married life by abandoning his wife. Some people say he abandoned her. He said he went to get a higher spiritual learning. That was 45, 50 years ago. She now lives in poverty. He's the prime minister. But he's above any kind of reproach as far as corruption is concerned. He also is the leader of the Indian People's Party, which is an ultra-nationalist political party movement. Largely, I'm going to try it again. Let's see if I can do it without killing it. Largely found in the north of India. It doesn't have a lot of support in the south. You see him in the picture with Barack Obama. Now, the positive side of Modi is this man who can make things happen. He can develop his state. He gets things done. However, he's also appealed to Hindu nationalism and the more radical elements of Hindu nationalism. And I'll show you some really scary parts of this. Part of what he talks about is this is the manifest destiny part, the demographic dividend. We have a demographer over here who will tell you 1.3 billion people are a lot of people and mouths to feed. A society that has that many people needs to do something about it. Modi says no. This is a gift from the gods that is going to basically propel India and lead the country into the Asian century. The destiny that he perceives is the Asian countries, China and India, growing, dominating the world economy, and India, because of its fairly high levels of college-educated people. The average Indian is not well educated, but you have a large number of scientists and engineers. They're going to be able to lead and move ahead of China. And they will be one of the dominant powers. This is his vision of the world. And how do you get to that vision? Uh-oh. All right, well, forget about that. There's some pictures up there. You can look at them. I'm not quite sure what happened.
White text.
What?
I think it's white text on a white background.
Yeah, but
Photos.
yeah, on my computer it was not. So, what you now have is this effort to mobilize radical movement, or at least the more radical Hindu movement within India. And this has become the more frightening part of the Modi government. I always forget the name of the movie. Helen Mirren was in a movie about a French restaurant called The 100 Steps. Is it The 100 Steps? I always want to say The 100 Walker. The 100 Steps. It's about just a few. How many people have seen it? Anyone? Okay, a few people. It's about a Muslim family whose restaurant in Mumbai was burned in anti-Muslim riots. The movie doesn't bring out the Muslim side of it. But the riots that chased this family out of India were fomented by Narendra Modi when he was the governor of Gujarat. And basically he urged his supporters and followers to go out and remove the Muslim plague in the country. And they went, Mumbai isn't even in his state, but they went out and tens of thousands of people were killed in the rioting. President Bush banned Modi from coming to the United States because he was seen as a terrorist leader because of this action. President Obama kept that ban in place, but then suddenly in May of 2014 had a very, very difficult decision of whether the new Prime Minister of India he was going to even allow to talk to. And basically the US, because India is one of our allies, the U.S. had to sort of relent and allow Modi to be able to come to the United States. That's where that slide with Modi and Obama comes from. So what you end up having is he has fomented this movement. When he came into power, many of his followers now have sort of felt they have the ability and right to go out and do whatever they want to do. And so you have incidents across the country. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. You have several people that were believed to be eating beef who have been murdered. You have situations where, well, one of the more recent outrages is a Muslim university was shut down and actually was at first attacked because it was believed they were serving beef in their cafeteria. They're trying to ban beef. You can always get meat in India. It was always there. Now they're trying to completely erase the beef that is eaten. You have a whole effort of these people that basically it's been pretty horrific, the sort of things that go on. I have a former student who works for UNICEF. She's Vietnamese, grew up in Lincoln. Vietnamese eat a lot of pork, and she likes pork. She's scared. She's scared to go to the market. That's while she buys the pork in the markets that Westerners go to, someone's going to see her buying animal meat and come after her. That's the kind of fear that's sort of taken over. Modi, throughout all of these events, has remained very, very silent. Let me see if I have other slides that work. You also have attacks against Muslims and Christians because they are not Hindu. You have the whole beginning of this intimidation that's going on throughout India. One of the more bizarre events is that back in September, Modi closed the border between Nepal and India. Now, I don't know how much you know about Nepal. It's one of the poorest countries in the world. It is abysmally poor. Almost about 90% of the products that are imported into Nepal come across from the Indian border. And that means about 98% of the fuel oil, gasoline. So when Modi shut the border down, it meant Nepal no longer had gasoline. Literally, the capital city of Kathmandu went back to bullock carts and horse-drawn carriages because you didn't have gasoline. It was selling for a phenomenal amount. The reason he shut it down was because the Nepalese enacted or promulgated a brand new constitution, which Modi did not like. The new constitution, one of the more offensive elements of the new constitution, if I gone off the page, okay. One of the more offensive elements in Modi's eyes was the fact that Nepal, prior to that, under the old monarchy, had been a Hindu monarchy, and it enshrined Hinduism as the state religion. In the new constitution, they dropped that. And that was one of Modi's main objections. So he shut down the border. I've heard reports that they're now allowing some products to come across since the middle of February. But for almost 6 months, Nepal has been starved into nearly oblivion. Basically put back into the 19th century by the actions that were an effort to try to force them to change, to become or return to being a Hindu state. Now, when these things happen, there is a slightly positive side to some degree. A lot of aid agencies, when it happened, suddenly started supplying Nepal with solar generators. So you have all these solar units coming into the country, which actually have electricity in places now. That was one of the things that they lost. About half of their electrical power grid came from using fuel oil, and that had to all shut down. But anyway, this is how far this sort of radical Hindu agenda goes. The other incident is the one down below. The most prestigious university in India, JNU. It's named after the first Prime Minister of India. He was the father of Indira Gandhi, the later Prime Minister. It's in Delhi. It's a prestigious university. The students of the university began to demonstrate with the faculty against some of the actions that were happening. Most of it had to do with caste, and I'll talk in a minute about caste violence, because that's another feature of the changes that are going on. Basically, they started demonstrating. What the government did is they went into the university, they arrested the president because he had criticized the nationalists who were coming into the university grounds and beating up students. And when he criticized the nationalists, he was charged under a sedition law that the British used when they arrested Mahatma Gandhi and actually Nehru. The law is still on the books. Any criticism of the government is considered to be sedition. And he was arrested and taken away in handcuffs. This is the kind of behavior. All what this is about is an effort to redefine what India is about as a Hindu nation, rather than a nation of diverse cultures. The caste violence is another factor. Modi's movement is an upper caste political movement, as many of the movements are. Again, this is where we get into some of the stereotypes. The overwhelming majority of people are at the lower ends of the caste structure. You are born into a caste. You can't leave it or change it. You are in it for life. It's sort of a birthright that you have. The upper caste people are believed to have qualities. Obviously, there's certain qualities they have that make them better than lower caste people. They're more honest. They're the leaders. There are castes which provide leadership. Now, caste was rapidly dying in India. The urban areas, it's breaking down rapidly. And if you meet educated Indians, they'll tell you, oh, caste isn't important. In the villages, it still is important. You do not marry out of caste. Lower castes don't interact with upper castes. There's no physical contact. There's no interactions. At least there are certain interactions, but very little personal interaction between the castes. What has been happening is that over the last 40 years or so, the lower castes in India have started to assert their rights. They've begun to try to assert the fact that they are equals in the society, and Indian law technically treats them as equals. What has happened in the last 2 years is that the upper castes are challenging this effort to assert the rights of lower caste people. And a lot of times it comes down, one of the more horrific sorts of events are lower caste weddings, when they're holding their wedding reception. The upper caste will go barricade the doors and set the building on fire. There was an incident about a month ago of, I think, 18 to 20 people killed. There was an earlier incident where the young man, the groom, wanted to ride to the wedding. If you have money in India, you ride an elephant or a horse to the wedding. Indians put a lot of effort into their weddings. They're really, if you've never been to an Indian wedding, you've really missed what weddings are about. But in any case, this young lower caste man wanted to ride a white horse, dressed up in his wedding garb to the wedding. The upper caste told him he was not permitted, and he went ahead and did it. And the wedding was disrupted, and I believe the bride or groom was killed. So you have this caste violence. Throughout all of this violence, Modi has remained very, very silent. He hasn't spoken out against it, which has gotten a lot of people upset. What you see within Modi and his movement is this effort to redefine what it means to be Indian. And it's kind of a scary, scary side. He talks about making India great again. I believe that was unfortunately the slide that got messed up. He talks about basically his appeal to the lower classes that have been left behind economically. It's a very, very apparent appeal. I'll show you some of his supporters' comments. What is kind of shocking is if you ever get to meet Modi, he's a charming man. Very gentle, soft-spoken. And yet he's surrounded himself with this idea of nationalism, of Hindu nationalism, that has become so violent and so rabid that it really has begun to frighten a lot of people within India. This slide I was a little bit worried about. The Shiv Sena leader, Bal Thackeray, is a supporter of Modi. You can read the quote. Does everybody read it? I hopefully. All right. It is my dream that we create a Hindustan of the Hindus, India of the Hindus. Maharashtrians and Punjabis alone cannot fight against Islam. That is why I appeal to all Hindus to break the linguistic wall around them and come together so that we can bring Islam in this country down to its knees. It's a little strong. This is from a news article. A man who was taken out of his house because rumors that his family had killed and ate a cow. Over here, this is the scary side of Modi. This is the Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh, the RSS. Has anybody ever heard of the organization? Why? It's famous for one very good reason. It plotted and sent one of its members to murder Mahatma Gandhi. And for many years it was banned. Modi, since he was a young man, joined the movement and has been a member of the RSS. It is a vehement organization. Gandhi was killed because he tried to talk about Hindus and Muslims living together in peace. And that doesn't go over well with the RSS. This is the scary side of this sense of nationalism that's going on in India. And when you see Modi's support with the RSS, he still is unabashed supporter of them. And we have another one that didn't come through. It's, I believe, another quote.
Do you want me to read it out loud for you? I can kind of make it out back here.
Okay, yeah. What?
The population of Muslims and Christians is growing day by day. To reign in this, sinner will have to impose emergency, and Muslims and Christians will have to be forced to undergo sterilization so that they can't increase their numbers. This is from Hindu Maharashtra Vice President Sadi Eva Thakur.
Again, it's a supporter of Modi. It's a Hindu nationalist organization. We're not talking about people discriminating. We're talking about pretty radical attitudes. One of the beliefs in India, and actually it's shown out, unfortunately demographers have shown this, that Muslims are growing faster population-wise than the Hindus. And that is often used as this fear that India will no longer be a Hindu nation if these Muslims keep having more babies. And then you have the other issue now that has sort of taken over in Sri Lanka, and now the movement's spreading into India, of unethical conversions to Christianity, which are typically, I guess, the allegations are, and I know this is a fact, that people that convert are often given small amounts of money to convert. And so the result is that there's a movement in Sri Lanka to ban this, to sort of force out missionaries, to get them out of the country, to prevent them or throw them in jail if they have unethical conversions. That movement is now spreading into India as well. Again, this is part of this fear of these nationalists that they're going to have a society that will no longer be Hindu, or it will change the identity of what it means to be Hindu. I've spent a lot of time with, as a professor at a Methodist school. The British Methodists had a mission to go to South Asia and build schools, especially in Sri Lanka. And then there were a lot of American Methodists. And you find these Methodist communities that are dominated by the Methodist Church. And a lot of times what's happened is most of the Methodists, their kids grew up to be Hindus. But the Methodist Church is still there. There's 3 parishioners that come every Sunday for the sermon. The Methodists are not into conversion the same way some of the more Pentecostal groups are that are coming into India. So you have this sense among the Hindus. The Hindu religion is very amorphous. You can be an atheist, you can believe in lots of gods, you can believe in one God, you can believe in Jesus Christ as the Son of God. It's all right. So when people convert, often, hey, it's okay. And if they offer me money, I'll convert and see what happens. But they still may go and worship in their temple. So it's very easy to convert. And that scares these Hindu nationalists. Another feature of this movement, and this is something that has just sprung up in the last 2 years, I know very little about it. There are these summer camps that are appearing. And apparently young girls and boys, mostly boys though, the picture shows a girl, but are being trained in military weaponry. They're not part of the military. They go and work out. It's like a boot camp. And again, it spreads a very strong message of Hindu nationalism and Hindu exclusion. The Durga Vahini. Durga is, I should have brought a picture of the goddess Durga. Durga, when I talked about animal sacrifice, Durga wants blood in worship. And she's often portrayed in pictures with skulls of humans around her neck. Men only. She doesn't attack women. Women like her. And in some parts of India, she's a good goddess. In other parts, you don't mess with Durga. So the idea of trying to create this movement with her name. Again, I keep making movie references. If any of you have seen Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, Durga worshippers, okay? Pull the heart out of the people they're sacrificing. But in any case, this is part of this nationalism. So, national identity is constantly changing. It's constantly evolving. And what you have, and especially in India today, is this effort to redefine national identity. Unfortunately, the effort is being quite successful because it's unfortunately going to remove or eliminate about 250 million of the Indian population, those who are Muslim and Christian. As I said before, the second most populous Muslim country in the world is India. So what's happening is, this is going on. Again, I did not mention it earlier. Last summer was the first International Day of Yoga in June, which there were millions of people across the United States and Europe and in India that went out and practiced yoga out in the open. What this was, yoga is one of the main schools of Hinduism. And Modi is very worried that these Westerners that practice yoga have taken the religion out of yoga. They just use it as physical exercise. And so what this was an effort to try to capture this back and to send a very strong message to the Muslims and Christians that here, worldwide, look, and this goes over in villages, keep in mind, look at these hundreds of millions of people across the world practicing yoga and standing up for the right of Hindus in India. You know, they weren't really doing that, but they were dupes. And, you know, the next International Day of Yoga is scheduled in late June again, and we'll see what happens. But it was a very strong message to the Muslims of India. Now, this is the negative side of things. In Sri Lanka, and I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes to talk about at least, again, going back, I don't want to try to go back and navigate the slides back to one of David's earlier slides when he talked about international actions affecting nationalism. In Sri Lanka, you have this very radical Sinhalese Buddhism. I talked about the Buddhist monks who support violence and use of force against the Hindus who rebelled in the country. After the Hindus were subdued, there was an effort in the country to try to take over Hindu land, to settle Sinhalese Buddhists in the areas that the Hindus lived. There was efforts to remove temples and to build Buddhist temples all over that area. And you had a government that was very, very supportive of this. They were also kidnapping journalists and murdering them. Anyone who spoke up against this disappeared or were arrested. They had defeated this guerrilla movement, or terrorist movement, if you want to call it that, of the Tamils, and basically had complete control of those areas. Now, what ended up happening was the US government became involved. And we worked with some politicians who had supported the government and persuaded them to challenge the government in elections. And you had a new government elected that is working, trying to work with the international community to reconcile the differences between Tamils and Sinhalese. They're not very successful because most of the population of Buddhists still want to put the Tamils in their place. But the US government is applying very heavy pressure. The United Nations is threatening an international criminal inquiry. And what you have is at least there is pressure. The difficulty is that if the government goes along with trying to reconcile the differences, a lot of the population will not vote for them. And the old leadership is still out there sort of trying to promote their goals of taking over the Tamil areas. This is Sinhalese Buddhism, Buddhist nationalism, not Hindu nationalism. I mean, the Hindus are there trying to maintain their culture. So what we have, at least, is a little more positive movement. If I can return for 1 second back to India. Modi, there's been a lot of dissatisfaction with this government. He hasn't even been in power for 2 years. He has an overwhelming majority in the parliament of the country, which means he can stay in power for another 4 years. But there is growing dissatisfaction. He was unbelievably widely supported in the country by almost all Hindus. That is eroding. And if it erodes enough, perhaps there could be some defections in the parliament to either force him to change this role, or he could be voted out of office and a more secular government. The problem in India is the government that has dominated India, the Congress Party, or at least the party that has dominated India up until Modi's election. The Congress Party it's the party of Indira Gandhi, of Nehru. It's extremely corrupt. And so their last spell in government was just unbelievable amounts of corruption. So there isn't really an alternative to Modi. So what you have in India is a country that for the last 3 years has been growing faster than China. China is one of the fastest growing countries in the world. Economically, it's being transformed almost on a daily basis. Modi has also sent satellites. I think he's got a Mars probe that's going to arrive in Mars in a couple of years. Basically, he's pushing the science and also pushing this nationalist agenda as part of his identity. Now, I made comments earlier, trying not to be too humorous, about making India great again. Politicians can appeal to certain groups. And that is why this nationalism gets restructured. And if they gain power, they're able to use that power to create nationalism and a nationalist movement to back them. And in India, you have a really remarkable case that in less than 2 years, Modi has given a new life and energy to this, what was a fringe movement of extremists. Thank you.